Ladies and gentlemen, there is a gentle whisper in the atmosphere of your life, a divine call that seeks to guide you, comfort you, and propel you into your destiny. But too often, that whisper is drowned by the thunder of our own thoughts. God is trying to reach you urgently, but the barrier is not his absence, it is our overthinking. Overthinking is a spiritual blockade. It builds walls of doubt, fear, and indecision where God has already paved roads of clarity. God doesn't call you to figure everything out. He calls you to trust him. God often speaks in quiet, subtle ways, gently weaving his voice into the fabric of our daily lives. His whispers are soft yet profound, carrying the depth of divine wisdom and love. They come to us in moments of stillness, in the rustling leaves, in the soft glow of the sunrise, and in the unshakable peace that fills our hearts when we draw near to him. But how often do we fail to hear him? How often do we drown his voice with the noise of our own overthinking? Overthinking is one of the greatest hindrances to hearing the voice of God. It clutters the mind, turning what should be moments of reflection and trust into cycles of endless doubt and questioning. When God speaks, he doesn't shout over the chaos, he whispers into the quiet corners of our souls. Yet, when our minds are filled with overanalysis, replaying scenarios, and second-guessing every decision, we make it nearly impossible to recognize his voice. This divine whisper is not a forceful command, it is an invitation. It beckons us to pause, to step away from the frantic pace of our lives and the ceaseless noise in our heads. God's whispers are reminders of his presence, of his desire to walk with us and guide us. He is not far from us, but our overthinking creates a chasm that only stillness and trust can bridge. Think of Elijah on Mount Horeb. After the earthquake, the fire, and the wind, the presence of God was found in a gentle whisper. This profound moment illustrates a key truth: God's power and guidance are often revealed in the quiet, in the subtle movements of his spirit, rather than in dramatic displays. Yet in our overthinking, we demand thunderous signs and bold declarations. We look for God in the spectacular while he waits for us in the stillness. Overthinking is rooted in fear, the fear of making a mistake, the fear of the unknown, the fear of losing control. We analyze every detail, hoping to gain a sense of certainty before we act. But God doesn't operate on the terms of human certainty. He operates in faith. When we overthink, we replace faith with doubt, trust with anxiety. We allow the noise of our minds to drown out the still small voice of God, calling us to rest in him. God's whispers are not meant to be deciphered through logic alone. They are spiritual impressions, nudges, and insights that resonate deeply within us. But to perceive them, we must quiet our inner noise. Overthinking pulls us into the realm of self-reliance, where we attempt to solve spiritual matters with human reasoning. Yet the voice of God is best heard when we surrender that need for control and lean into the simplicity of his presence. When God speaks, he doesn't complicate our lives, he simplifies them. His voice brings peace, clarity, and direction. It doesn't mean there won't be challenges or uncertainties, but his whispers remind us that he is with us in every step. Overthinking, on the other hand, amplifies the complexities of life. It causes us to question what God has already made clear, delaying our obedience and leaving us trapped in a cycle of hesitation. Imagine the opportunities missed because we were too busy overanalyzing what God was already calling us to do. When he whispers, go, we question whether we are ready. When he whispers, trust me, we demand more signs. And when he whispers, be still, we fill the silence with more noise, more thinking, and more striving. God's whispers require a response of faith, not endless analysis. The beauty of God's gentle voice lies in its consistency. He doesn't grow impatient with us. Even when we fail to listen, he continues to speak, waiting for the moment when we finally quiet our thoughts and tune into his frequency. His whispers remind us that we are not alone, that he sees our struggles, and that he desires to guide us through them. They carry the assurance that his plans for us are good, even when we can't see the full picture. Learning to hear God's whispers requires intentionality. It requires us to step away from the distractions of life and create space for his voice. Overthinking thrives on busyness, but God's whispers thrive in stillness. In those moments of quiet, we begin to recognize the gentle ways he speaks through his word, through prayer, and through the peace that surpasses all understanding. God calls us to trust him because he knows the end from the beginning. He sees what we cannot, and his whispers often point us toward paths that don't make sense to our human reasoning. Overthinking demands guarantees, but trust rests in the assurance of his character. God's whispers are not just words, they are expressions of his love and care for us, inviting us to lean not on our own understanding, but on him. In the noise of overthinking, we lose sight of the beauty of surrender. God doesn't need our exhaustive plans, he needs our willingness to listen and obey. His whispers remind us that we don't have to figure everything out because he already has. The gentle voice of God doesn't compete for our attention, it waits for us to choose him over the noise. Faith is the foundation of our relationship with God, the very essence of how we align ourselves with his will and purpose. It is not built on perfect understanding, exhaustive knowledge, or absolute certainty. Rather, it thrives in trust, obedience, and surrender. Yet, overthinking often becomes the silent enemy of faith, creeping into our minds and convincing us that we must first analyze, dissect, and understand every detail before we can move forward. Overthinking creates a false narrative that faith requires the clarity of reason, but God has always called us to trust him beyond what we can see or comprehend. Overthinking is rooted in our desire for control. We analyze because we want guarantees, we hesitate because we fear the unknown. But God does not operate within the limits of our logic. His ways are higher than our ways, and his thoughts are higher than our thoughts. Faith, by its very nature, calls us to step out of our comfort zones and into the divine unknown. It asks us to trust in the character of God, even when his plans seem unclear or his timing seems delayed. Consider Abraham, who was called to leave his homeland and go to a place he did not know. Abraham didn't have a detailed map, a timeline, or all the answers. What he had was a word from God and a heart willing to trust. His faith was not in his understanding of the journey, but in the one who called him. If Abraham had overthought every detail, questioning how, when, and why, he might never have taken the first step. Faith required him to trust the promise even when the process was unclear. Overthinking often paralyzes us with questions. What if I fail? What if I'm not ready? What if this isn't the right decision? These questions, while natural, are rooted in fear rather than faith. Faith, on the other hand, doesn't demand that we know all the answers. It simply asks that we trust the one who does. Overthinking turns our focus inward, magnifying our doubts and insecurities, while faith shifts our focus upward, reminding us of God's power, wisdom, and unfailing love. When we analyze too much, we limit God to the boundaries of human logic. We try to fit his infinite wisdom into our finite understanding. But God's plans are often beyond comprehension because they are designed to stretch our faith and draw us closer to him. Faith is not about understanding every detail. It is about trusting that God is working all things together for our good, even when we can't see how. Jesus often emphasized the simplicity of faith. He said that if we have faith as small as a mustard seed, we can move mountains. He didn't say we needed a perfect understanding of how mountains move or why they are there in the first place. He said that faith, the kind of trust that believes God is who he says he is and will do what he says he will do, is enough. Overthinking complicates what God has made simple. It distracts us from the truth that his power is made perfect in our weakness, not in our intellectual strength. In our overthinking, we also risk delaying obedience. How many times have we hesitated to act on God's instructions because we were too busy analyzing them? We seek confirmation after confirmation, waiting for the perfect moment or the perfect understanding, but God often calls us to step out in faith before everything makes sense. Delayed obedience is disobedience, and overthinking can become the very thing that keeps us from walking in the fullness of God's plan. Faith is not blind optimism. It is rooted in the reality of who God is. It is anchored in his promises, his character, and his track record of faithfulness. When we overthink, we shift our focus away from God's faithfulness and onto our own uncertainties. But faith reminds us that God is not asking for perfection, he is asking for trust. He doesn't require us to figure it all out. He simply asks us to follow him step by step, even when the path ahead is unclear. Overthinking exhausts the mind, but faith refreshes the soul. It lifts the burden of trying to control everything and places it in the hands of the one who controls all things. Faith invites us to rest in the assurance that God is sovereign, that he sees the bigger picture, and that he is working behind the scenes for our good. When we choose faith over analysis, we find peace that surpasses all understanding, not because we know the answers, but because we trust the one who does. God doesn't require us to have perfect understanding before we take the next step. He doesn't need us to solve every problem or have every question answered. What he desires is a heart that is willing to trust him completely, even in the face of uncertainty. Faith is the bridge between our limitations and God's limitless power. It is the antidote to overthinking, calling us to release our need for control and place our trust fully in him. God's communication with us is not limited to words or visions. He often uses signs, circumstances, people, and inner convictions to guide and direct us. These divine nudges are his way of reaching out, steering us toward his purpose and aligning us with his will. Yet overthinking often clouds our ability to recognize them. We dissect and analyze these moments so deeply that we miss the simplicity and clarity of God's message. God speaks through circumstances, orchestrating events in ways that cannot be mere coincidence. These moments may come as open doors of opportunity, unexpected delays, or even challenges that stretch our faith. They are not random, they are part of his divine plan to shape us and draw us closer to him. However, overthinking turns these circumstances into puzzles we try to solve instead of messages we should receive. Instead of asking God, "What are you showing me?" we ask, "Why is this happening?" We focus so much on trying to make sense of the situation that we overlook the hand of God at work. People are another way God nudges us. He places individuals in our lives to encourage, correct, or inspire us. Sometimes their words carry wisdom that resonates deeply within us, affirming what God has already placed on our hearts. But overthinking can cause us to dismiss these divine appointments. We may question their motives, overanalyze their words, or convince ourselves that it's merely a coincidence. In doing so, we risk ignoring the very vessels God has chosen to deliver his message. Inner convictions, the still small voice within us, are perhaps the most personal and profound way God communicates. These are the moments when we feel a strong prompting to act, to speak, to move in a certain direction, or to stop, to wait, and to trust. These impressions are not the product of human reasoning, but the work of the Holy Spirit guiding our hearts. Overthinking, however, turns these convictions into a mental tug of war. We question whether it's truly God speaking or merely our own thoughts. We second guess the timing, the outcome, and the implications, and in doing so, we delay or even dismiss the action God is calling us to take. The story of Gideon offers a powerful example of how overthinking can affect our response to God's nudges. When God called Gideon to deliver Israel, he hesitated, asking for multiple signs to confirm what God had already made clear. While God graciously accommodated Gideon's doubts, the repeated requests for confirmation revealed how overthinking can hinder obedience. Gideon's initial reluctance was rooted in his own insecurities and his need for certainty, but God's call was not dependent on Gideon's qualifications. It was dependent on Gideon's willingness to trust. Overthinking blinds us to the simplicity of God's nudges because it shifts our focus from God's sovereignty to our limitations. We try to analyze divine movements through the lens of human logic, forgetting that his ways are higher than ours. God's nudges are not always grand or dramatic. Often they are subtle yet unmistakable. A timely conversation, an unshakable feeling of peace, or even a closed door can all be signs of his guidance. But when we overthink, we miss these moments because we're too busy looking for something more obvious or more logical. Recognizing divine nudges requires spiritual sensitivity and a heart tuned to God's frequency. It requires us to quiet the noise of our overthinking and trust that God is speaking, even when his methods seem unexpected. Sometimes he uses the most ordinary circumstances to reveal extraordinary truths. What seems like an inconvenience may be his way of redirecting us. What feels like a setback may be his way of protecting us. But if we're consumed with analyzing every detail, we fail to see the bigger picture he is painting. God's nudges are often invitations to step out in faith. They don't always come with guarantees or full explanations, but they carry the assurance of his presence. When we trust these nudges, we position ourselves to experience his power and provision in ways that go beyond our understanding. Overthinking, on the other hand, keeps us stuck, questioning whether we're ready, whether we're qualified, or whether we've interpreted the signs correctly. It paralyzes us with doubt instead of propelling us into action. God is always speaking, always guiding, always nudging us toward his best for our lives. But hearing him requires us to stop overanalyzing and start trusting. It requires us to recognize that not every moment needs to be understood fully to be embraced. His divine nudges are not puzzles to solve, but invitations to follow. When we let go of the need to overthink, we make room for the simplicity of his voice and the profound beauty of his guidance. Overthinking carries a hidden cost that many fail to recognize until it is too late, the cost of delay. Every moment we spend analyzing, doubting, or questioning the path God has set before us is a moment we rob from his ability to work through our obedience. God's timing is intentional, precise, and purposeful, but overthinking often pulls us out of alignment with that divine timing. Instead of acting when he calls, we hesitate, allowing fear, doubt, or uncertainty to stall what he desires to do in and through us. Delayed obedience is, in essence, disobedience. When God speaks, he doesn't do so lightly. His instructions carry weight, purpose, and urgency, even when we may not immediately understand them. Yet when we overthink, we treat his command as optional, something to consider rather than something to follow. This hesitation can lead to missed opportunities, both for ourselves and for those God intended to bless through our actions. Consider the story of Jonah. God called Jonah to go to Nineveh and deliver a message of repentance. But instead of obeying, Jonah overthought the situation. He questioned the wisdom of God's plan, doubted the worthiness of the people of Nineveh, and allowed his personal biases to overshadow God's command. His delay in obedience led to a storm, a detour through the belly of a great fish, and unnecessary hardship, not just for Jonah, but for those on the ship with him. While God ultimately fulfilled his plan, the delay came at a cost. Jonah's story reminds us that our overthinking doesn't just affect us, it can ripple out and impact those around us. Overthinking often stems from a desire for certainty, but faith rarely operates within the bounds of certainty. God's instructions are often designed to stretch us, to move us beyond our comfort zones, and to deepen our dependence on him. If we wait until every question is answered, every detail is clear, and every doubt is resolved, we may never take the first step. And in waiting, we risk losing the moment God has ordained for breakthrough, transformation, or blessing. Time is one of the most precious resources God has given us, and overthinking can squander it. The opportunities God places before us are oftentimes sensitive, designed for a specific season or moment. When we delay, we may find that the window of opportunity closes, not because God's plan has changed, but because we failed to move when he called. The cost of delay is not just a missed opportunity, it's also the erosion of faith. Each moment of hesitation reinforces doubt and diminishes trust, making it harder to obey the next time God speaks. The Israelites wandering in the wilderness provide a poignant example of the cost of delay. God brought them to the edge of the promised land, ready to lead them into their inheritance. But instead of trusting his promise, they overthought the challenges ahead. They focused on the giants in the land, the fortified cities, and their own inadequacies, allowing fear to override faith. Their hesitation and disobedience delayed their entry into the promised land by 40 years. What could have been a journey of trust and victory became a prolonged season of wandering and waiting, all because they overthought instead of obeyed. God's plans are always for our good, but they require our cooperation. When he calls us to act, it's because he has already prepared the way. Our overthinking doesn't change his plan, but it can change our ability to experience it fully. The longer we delay, the more we risk missing out on the blessings, growth, and purpose he has for us. Overthinking traps us in a cycle of analysis paralysis, keeping us stuck in the realm of possibilities instead of stepping into the reality of God's power. Obedience is not about having all the answers, it's about trusting the one who does. It's about recognizing that God's instructions are not burdens, but blessings designed to position us for his best. Every moment we spend overthinking is a moment we give to fear instead of faith, to doubt instead of trust. And in doing so, we delay not just our own progress, but the fulfillment of God's purpose in our lives. God calls us to walk by faith, not by sight. He doesn't need us to understand everything. He simply needs us to trust him enough to move when he says, go. When we let go of overthinking and embrace obedience, we step into the flow of his timing and the fullness of his plans. The cost of delay is too great a price to pay. God is ready to move in your life, but he needs your yes, not your hesitation. God's plans for you are far greater than anything you could ever conceive or imagine. His wisdom is limitless and his purpose is eternal. Yet overthinking often blinds us to the beauty of his divine process. At its core, overthinking is an attempt to control, to understand every step, every detail, and every outcome before we take a single move. But God's ways are higher than our ways, and his thoughts are higher than our thoughts. He doesn't call us to figure it all out. He calls us to trust the process. Trusting the process begins with acknowledging that God is sovereign and that his plans are always for your good, even when they don't make sense in the moment. He sees the beginning and the end, the full picture of your life that you cannot yet comprehend. Overthinking, however, narrows your focus to the immediate, to the things you feel are within your control. It shifts your attention from God's infinite capability to your finite understanding, leaving you trapped in a cycle of doubt and fear. Control is an illusion. The more we try to hold on to it, the more anxious and uncertain we become. Overthinking is a symptom of this desire for control, a way of convincing ourselves that if we analyze enough, plan enough, or anticipate enough, we can ensure the outcome we desire. But God is not asking for your control, he's asking for your surrender. He's asking you to trust that his process, no matter how confusing or challenging it may seem, is leading you toward his perfect will. Look at the story of Joseph. God gave him a dream of greatness, but the process to get there was anything but straightforward. Sold into slavery by his brothers, falsely accused and imprisoned, Joseph had every reason to overthink his situation, to question God's plan, or to doubt the dream he had received. Yet, through it all, Joseph trusted the process. He recognized that God was working behind the scenes, orchestrating events that would not only fulfill his promise, but also save countless lives. When Joseph finally stood before his brothers as the ruler of Egypt, he declared, "You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good." That's the power of trusting God's process. Trusting the process doesn't mean there won't be times of uncertainty or difficulty. It means believing that every step, even the painful ones, serves a purpose in God's greater plan. Overthinking tries to make sense of the challenges, but faith chooses to trust that God is using them to refine, strengthen, and prepare you for what lies ahead. The delays, the setbacks, the unanswered questions, they are not signs of God's absence, but evidence of his careful, deliberate work in your life. One of the greatest barriers to trusting the process is the need for immediate results. We live in a world that values quick answers and instant gratification, but God's timing is not bound by human expectations. Overthinking often stems from impatience, from the feeling that if we could just understand why something is taking so long, we could endure it better. But God's process is not about speed, it's about depth. He is more interested in building your character than meeting your deadlines. He is more concerned with preparing your heart than fulfilling your timeline. Think of the potter and the clay. The clay doesn't understand the shaping, the pressing, or the heat of the kiln, but the potter knows exactly what it takes to create a vessel of beauty and purpose. In the same way, God is shaping you through his process, even when you don't understand it. Overthinking distracts you from this truth, making you resist the very work God is doing in your life. Trust calls you to rest in his hands, knowing that he is creating something far greater than you could ever imagine. Trusting the process also requires humility. It's an acknowledgement that you don't have all the answers, that your perspective is limited, and that your plans are not always aligned with God's will. Overthinking is rooted in pride, the belief that you must figure it all out on your own. But humility allows you to release that burden and place your confidence in God's infinite wisdom. It's a declaration that you trust Him more than you trust yourself. God's process is not always easy, but it is always good. He is not just concerned with the destination, He is invested in the journey. Every step, every season, every moment is part of His master plan to draw you closer to Him and to fulfill the purpose for which He created you. Overthinking may try to convince you to take control, to question His timing, or to doubt His ways, but trust reminds you that He is faithful, that He is working all things together for your good, and that His process is leading you to a place of blessing, purpose, and peace. True clarity is found not in the relentless pursuit of answers, but in the quiet act of surrender. Overthinking clutters the mind and drowns out the still, small voice of God. It fills the soul with noise, confusion, and an overwhelming sense of striving. But God doesn't operate in chaos, He moves in peace. When you surrender your overthinking, you create the space for His direction to become clear and His peace to take root in your heart. Surrender is not weakness, it is strength. It is an act of faith, a deliberate choice to release control and trust that God knows the way forward. When we cling to our overthinking, we hold tightly to the illusion that we can figure everything out on our own. We replay scenarios, analyze every angle, and exhaust ourselves trying to predict outcomes. But this striving only pushes us further from the clarity we seek. God doesn't need us to have all the answers. He simply needs us to trust Him enough to let go. Surrender opens the door to divine wisdom. When you lay down your need to overthink, you make room for God's voice to speak clearly into your situation. His guidance is not found in the overanalyzed details or the endless mental debates. It is found in the quiet moments of stillness and trust. The Bible reminds us, be still and know that I am God. Stillness is where surrender begins. It is in the act of releasing our thoughts, fears, and need for control that we position ourselves to hear His direction. Consider the story of Mary and Martha. When Jesus visited their home, Martha was consumed with overthinking, worrying about preparations and all that needed to be done. Mary, on the other hand, chose to sit at Jesus' feet and listen. While Martha's mind raced with concerns, Mary surrendered her need to control and simply rested in His presence. Jesus praised Mary for choosing the better part, reminding us that surrender and listening lead to clarity and peace. Listening to God requires more than silence. It requires a heart that is open and receptive. Overthinking closes us off, making us more focused on our own solutions than on God's direction. Surrender, however, aligns us with His will. It shifts our focus from the problem to the one who holds the answer. When we surrender, we say, Lord, I trust You to lead me. I trust that Your wisdom is greater than my understanding. Surrender also brings peace, a peace that surpasses all understanding. Overthinking thrives on uncertainty, magnifying our fears and doubts. It tells us we need to have everything figured out before we can rest. But God's peace is not dependent on understanding. It is a gift that comes when we trust Him completely. When you surrender your overthinking, you exchange the weight of worry for the peace of knowing that God is in control. In the act of surrender, clarity often comes unexpectedly. It's not through the mental striving or exhaustive planning that solutions are revealed, but in the moments of trust and obedience. God's direction doesn't always come as a loud, unmistakable voice. It often comes as a gentle nudge, a quiet assurance, or a sense of peace about the next step. But you cannot recognize these signs if your mind is clouded with overthinking. Surrender creates the space for God to move, to speak, and to guide. Abraham's story illustrates the power of surrender. When God asked him to sacrifice his son Isaac, Abraham didn't fall into overthinking. He didn't question God's plan or try to figure out how it would all work out. Instead, he surrendered completely, trusting that God's promises were true and that His plan was good. In Abraham's surrender, God provided a ram as a substitute for Isaac, proving that clarity and provision come through trust, not analysis. Releasing your overthinking doesn't mean you abandon responsibility or stop making thoughtful decisions. It means you stop trying to control what only God can. It means you listen more than you question, trust more than you analyze, and rest more than you strive. Surrender allows you to move forward in faith, confident that God is leading you even when the path ahead is unclear. True clarity is not something you can manufacture. It is a gift from God. It comes when you let go of your need to overthink and open your heart to his voice. His direction may not always come in the way you expect, but it will always be perfect. When you surrender and listen, you will find not only the clarity you seek, but also the peace and confidence to walk in his purpose for your life. When you stop overthinking and start trusting God, you position yourself to experience his peace, his clarity, and his purpose in your life. God is not asking you to have all the answers or figure out every detail. He is asking you to release your doubts, quiet your mind, and make room for his voice. The journey of faith is not about perfect understanding. It's about trusting the one who holds your future in his hands. So surrender your overthinking, let go of your need for control, and lean into the gentle whispers of his spirit. He is calling you, guiding you, and preparing you for something greater than you can imagine. Trust him, and you will see that his plans are always good, his timing is always perfect, and his purpose will always prevail.